A $10 billion deal, the culmination of a man's entire life's work, is about to be signed in an exclusive soundproof room high above New York City. For tech titan Julian Croft. This is the moment his legacy will be forged in steel and silicon. But what happens when the single most important person, the bridge between two languages, two cultures, two empires, vanishes? What happens when the deal begins to collapse into a black hole of misunderstanding, and the only person in the room who can save you is the one you've been ignoring all night? The waitress quietly refilling your water glass. This is the true story of how a multi-billion-dollar empire was saved by a voice no one expected to hear. The air in the private dining room of Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive its phone number was a coveted secret among Manhattan's elite, was thick with the scent of money and seared scallops. It was an atmosphere Julian Croft had cultivated his entire life. He sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, a king in his temporary court. His suit, a bespoke creation by Garrison of London, fit him like a second skin, the fabric whispering of success with every subtle movement. On his wrist, a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime didn't just tell time. It announced his arrival in the stratosphere of the world's wealthiest individuals. Julian wasn't old money. He hadn't inherited his empire. He had clawed it out of the digital ether. Croft Industries, born in a cramped Palo Alto garage 2 decades ago, was now a global technology behemoth. Tonight, however, was the final critical move in his greatest gambit. Yet the acquisition of Tanaka Robotics, a pioneering Japanese firm whose work in advanced AI and autonomous systems was 5 years ahead of anyone else. They called it Project Chimera. For Julian, it was everything. It was the future. Across from him sat David Chen, his ever-anxious vice president of mergers and acquisitions. David was meticulously arranging and rearranging 3 identical pens on his leather-bound portfolio, a nervous tick that always surfaced under pressure. "The wire transfers are staged and ready, Julian," David murmured, his voice a low hum of anxiety. "All we need is Mr. Tanaka's signature on the final page." "He'll sign David," Julian said, his tone laced with the unshakable confidence that had steamrolled so many competitors. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass of Yamazaki 18, a deliberate choice, a nod to his Japanese guests. "Mr. Tanaka is a pragmatist. He knows our offer is more than generous. It's a coronation." The plan was flawless, orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. The setting was perfect, the terms were ironclad, and the final crucial piece of the puzzle was Marcus Thorne, the best Japanese English interpreter on the East Coast. Marcus wasn't just a translator. He was a cultural whisperer, capable of navigating the treacherous currents of Japanese business etiquette, where what wasn't said was often more important than what was. Julian glanced at his watch. 7:15 p.m. The Tanaka delegation was due to arrive at 7:30 p.m. Marcus should have been here an hour ago to do a final prep. "Have you heard from Marcus?" Julian asked, a flicker of annoyance in his voice. Punctuality was a non-negotiable for him. David cleared his throat. "He texted about an hour ago, said he was caught in some unexpected traffic on the BQE, but would be here shortly. Let me try him again." David stepped away from the table, his phone pressed to his ear. Julian watched him, the first tiny crack appearing in his armor of composure. He hated variables. He hated loose ends. Marcus's tardiness was an unwelcome anomaly. Through the heavy oak door, a waitress slipped into the room. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark, intelligent eyes and black hair pulled back into a severe professional bun. Her movements were a study in quiet efficiency, as she refilled their water glasses. Her presence so unobtrusive she was like a ghost in a crisp white apron. Julian barely registered her existence. She was part of the scenery, like the expensive artwork on the walls or the crystal chandelier overhead. Her name tag read, Isabella. David returned to the table, his face pale, his usual professional mask crumbling. The hand holding his phone was trembling slightly. "Julian," he started, his voice strained. "There's a problem." "What kind of problem?" Julian's voice was cold, sharp. "That was Marcus's wife. He wasn't in traffic. He had a seizure while driving. Aneurysm. They have him at Mount Sinai. He's in emergency surgery." The words hung in the silent room, heavier than the billion-dollar figures on the table. The perfectly orchestrated evening had just been shattered by a single, catastrophic blow of fate. The king was suddenly without his herald, his diplomat, his most essential weapon. Julian felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. He looked at the intricately prepared table, the waiting documents the pen meant for signing away $10 billion. It all meant nothing now. "Get on the phone," Julian snapped his voice, a low growl. "Call every top-tier translation service in the city. I don't care what it costs. Get me a replacement, now." David fumbled with his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. "Julian, it's 7:20 on a Wednesday night. Finding someone of Marcus's caliber, someone vetted for this level of corporate sensitivity. It's impossible. They'd need to be briefed. They'd need to sign NDAs. I don't pay you for impossible." "David," Julian roared, slamming his fist on the table. The crystal glasses jumped the expensive whiskey, sloshing over the rim. The waitress, Isabella, who was just about to exit, flinched almost imperceptibly at the outburst, but otherwise remained composed, her hand on the doorknob. She glanced back at the scene, a flicker of something unreadable in her dark eyes before slipping out and closing the door softly behind her. Julian's mind raced. He could try to postpone, but that would be a show of weakness. Tanaka was old school. A failure to be prepared would be seen as an unforgivable insult. It could kill the deal permanently. His rivals at Omnicorp would be circling like vultures by morning. He felt a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, helplessness. He, Julian Croft, the master of the universe, was trapped. He was about to host the most important meeting of his life, and he couldn't speak the language. Right on cue, the maitre d' opened the door, his face a perfect porcelain mask of hospitality. "Mr. Croft," he announced with a slight bow. "Your guests have arrived, Mr. Ko. Kenji Tanaka and his associates are here." Julian's blood ran cold. He stood up, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. Through the doorway, he saw him, Mr. Tanaka, a man of 70, with a stern, impenetrable expression, flanked by two younger, equally stoic executives. They bowed. The trap had just been sprung, and Julian Croft had walked right into it. The initial pleasantries were a catastrophe. Julian, operating on pure adrenaline, extended a hand. Mr. Tanaka, expecting a formal bow, was momentarily thrown off. He recovered with practiced grace, giving Julian's hand a brief limp shake before executing a shallow, curt bow. It was a clumsy fusion of cultures, an immediate signal that things were off-kilter. "Mr. Tanaka," Julian said, his voice overly loud in the tense silence. "Welcome. An honor to have you." Mr. Tanaka offered a tight, unreadable smile and said something in Japanese to his two lieutenants, Mr. Sato and Mr. Yoshida. They didn't smile at all. David Chen, a man whose entire career was built on smooth interactions, looked like he was about to have a panic attack. He had a translation app open on his phone, a desperate, amateurish move that was the corporate equivalent of bringing a water pistol to a gunfight. Please have a seat, David said, gesturing to the table. He held his phone up. A tinny, robotic female voice squawked out a clumsy Japanese phrase that sounded more like a command than an invitation. Mr. Tanaka's eyebrow twitched. It was a minuscule movement, but to Julian it was a seismic event. He saw the flicker of disdain, the judgment. This is how the great Croft Industries operates, with cheap phone apps. They all sat. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the quiet, efficient movements of the waitress Isabella as she returned to pour water. She moved around the table with a practiced, almost invisible grace, her expression serene. A stark contrast to the thick cloud of anxiety gathering over the men. Julian barely noticed her. His focus was entirely on the impassive face of Kenji Tanaka. Julian knew he had to take control to say something. He had to explain the situation with Marcus. Without a proper translator, nuance was impossible. He needed simple, direct communication. He turned to David. The app. Tell him our interpreter had a medical emergency. Apologize profusely. David frantically typed into his phone. He held it up again. The robotic voice spoke another string of garbled syllables. Mr. Tanaka listened, his head tilted slightly. Then he spoke a long, measured sentence in Japanese. He gestured towards the door, then back at them, his expression severe. David looked at the app's attempt at a reverse translation. His face went white. What? Julian demanded. What did he say? The app says something like... David swallowed hard. He says, if your chosen warrior flees before the battle, it is a poor reflection on the general. He's deeply insulted, Julian. He thinks Marcus just bailed on us. The metaphor was brutal, a samurai's indictment. The deal wasn't just stalling. It was actively bleeding out on the polished mahogany. Julian felt a surge of hot, frustrated anger. This was all slipping through his fingers because of a damn language barrier. He tried again, speaking slowly and clearly, as if addressing a child. No, medical, emergency Dr. Hall Hospital. He made a gesture of a swan on his head, a move so clumsy and desperate, he immediately felt like a fool. Mr. Sato, the younger of Tanaka's aides, smirked. It was a quick, cruel flash of a smile, gone in an instant, but Julian saw it. They were enjoying this. They were watching the great Julian Croft, the American Titan, flounder like a fish on a dock. The appetizers arrived. Exquisite plates of tuna tataki and wagyu tartare, personally overseen by Aurelia's celebrity chef. In any other circumstance, it would have been a culinary triumph. Tonight, the food sat untouched. The chasm between the two sides of the table had become too wide to cross. Mr. Tanaka finally broke the silence. He spoke again this time with a tone of finality. He tapped his finger on the unsigned contract that lay in the center of the table like a corpse. Then he pushed his chair back, slightly, a clear signal that he was preparing to leave. David's app struggled to keep up. The translation that appeared on the screen was fragmented, almost nonsensical. Honor agreement, not toy. Time is wasted. We conclude. What does conclude mean? Julian hissed. Conclude the meeting. Conclude the deal. I don't know, David whispered back, frantic. The syntax is all wrong. It could mean anything. But Julian knew what it meant. He could feel it in the chilling finality of Tanaka's posture. It meant it's over. $10 billion, the future of his company, his legacy. All of it was evaporating in a fog of misunderstanding. He had lost. He had flown too close to the sun, and the man who was supposed to be his wings had fallen from the sky. In his mind, he could already hear the gloating voice of his chief rival, Franklin Pierce of Omnicorp. He could see the headlines, Croft's Japanese Gambit fails spectacularly. His stock would plummet. His board would be sharpening their knives. It was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. Mr. Tanaka placed his hands on the table, preparing to stand. Mr. Sato and Mr. Yoshida followed suit. This was it. The point of no return. Julian's mind went blank. For the first time in his professional life, he had no move left to make. The king was in checkmate. And then a new voice entered the suffocating silence. It was soft yet clear and perfectly pitched. It was not Julian's, nor David's, nor any of the Japanese men. "Forgive the interruption, Tanaka-sama." The voice was female, and it spoke in flawless, formal Japanese. Julian's head snapped up. Everyone turned to the source of the voice. Standing by the service station near the wall, holding a silver water pitcher, was the waitress, Isabella. Her face was calm, her posture respectful, but her eyes held a steady, commanding light that Julian had failed to notice before. She gave a slight, perfect bow towards Mr. Tanaka, a gesture of profound respect that was neither subservient nor timid. "I believe," she continued in Japanese, her tone conveying both apology for her audacity and confidence in her statement, "that there has been a grave misunderstanding of the highest degree." The silence that followed was of a different kind. It was no longer the silence of tension, but of pure, unadulterated shock. The three Japanese executives stared at her, their stoic masks completely shattered. David Chen's jaw was literally hanging open. And Julian Croft. Julian simply stared, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The ghost in the apron, the girl who refilled their water, had just spoken directly to Kenji Tanaka in his own language. And from the look on Tanaka's face, she had done it perfectly. For a long moment, no one moved. The universe of the private dining room seemed to have frozen, centered on the impossible figure of the waitress. Isabella remained poised, the silver pitcher still in her hand, her gaze directed respectfully towards Mr. Tanaka. She had thrown a grenade of sheer improbability into the room, and everyone was waiting for the shrapnel to land. It was Mr. Tanaka who recovered first. His initial shock morphed into a deep, furrowed brow curiosity. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes scrutinizing Isabella, not as a servant, but as an enigma. He responded in Japanese, his voice a low rumble, laced with suspicion. "And who are you to speak on such matters?" Before David's clumsy app could even begin to process the words, Isabella replied fluidly. "I am nobody, Tanaka-sama," she said, her Japanese carrying the subtle formal cadences known as kaigo, the honorific speech used in the most polite and professional of settings. It was a level of linguistic sophistication that took years, often a lifetime, to master. "I am merely a servant in this house who could not in good conscience stand by and watch a matter of such importance be derailed by a tragic accident and the failings of technology." She then turned her head slightly towards Julian, though her eyes remained downcast in a show of respect to Tanaka. She switched to perfect, unaccented English. "Mr. Croft?" Mr. Tanaka asked who I was to interject. I have told him I am a humble servant who wishes only to clarify a misunderstanding. Her voice was calm and steady, a beacon in the storm of Julian's panic. Julian was speechless. He could only nod, his mind reeling. David Chen looked as if he had just seen a dog begin to recite Shakespeare. Mr. Tanaka considered her for a moment longer. He looked at Julian's desperate face, at David's useless phone, and then back at the young woman who stood with the poise of a diplomat. He saw the truth of her words. The evening was indeed being derailed. Against all logic, against every protocol of his rigidly structured world, he made a decision. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Speak then," he said in Japanese. "Clarify." Isabella took a small, deferential step forward, placing the water pitcher silently on a nearby credenza. In that simple action, she shed the role of waitress and assumed another undefined but powerful. "Mr. Croft," she said, turning to him fully, "may I have your permission to mediate?" "Yes, of course, yes," Julian said, his voice raspy with relief and disbelief. "Whatever you need." Isabella nodded. She turned back to the Japanese delegation and bowed again, more deeply this time. "Tanaka-sama, Sato-san, Yoshida-san," she began, addressing each of them by name and with the correct honorific. "On behalf of Mr. Croft and his entire company, I wish to extend the most profound and sincere apologies for the events of this evening. It was never his intention to show you disrespect. The absence of his interpreter, Mr. Marcus Thorne, was not an act of querulousness or a strategic slight." She paused, letting the weight of her formal apology settle in the room. "Mr. Thorne, a man Mr. Croft holds in the highest professional esteem, suffered a sudden and life-threatening cerebral aneurysm on his way here tonight. He is at this very moment undergoing emergency surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital. Mr. Croft's distress, which you have witnessed, is not due to a failing of the deal, but from his shock and concern for a trusted colleague and his deep frustration at being unable to convey this to you properly." She delivered this information without melodrama, stating the facts with a solemn dignity that lent them immense power. As she spoke, Julian could see the expressions on the Japanese men's faces transform. The suspicion and anger were dissolving, replaced by comprehension, and then a dawning sympathy. The insult they had perceived was being reframed as a tragedy. Mr. Tanaka's stern facade softened visibly. He murmured, "Is that so?" Isabella then did something remarkable. She didn't just translate. She bridged the cultural gap. The clumsy attempts with the phone application and Mr. Croft's gestures, she said, a hint of a diplomatic smile touching her lips, were the desperate actions of a man who values your time and this partnership so immensely that he was willing to make a fool of himself rather than risk offending you by postponing. In our culture, she continued, skillfully aligning herself with Julian, sometimes our directness can be mistaken for crudeness. He was simply trying in the only way he could to express the gravity of the emergency. It was a masterstroke. She had not only explained the situation, but had also interpreted the cultural context of Julian's frantic behavior, transforming his insulting clumsiness into an act of desperate respect. Mr. Sato, the man who had smirked earlier, now had the decency to look slightly ashamed. Mr. Tanaka spoke at length, his tone now completely different. It was softer, more inquisitive. Isabella listened intently. Her head tilted, her focus absolute. When he finished, she turned to Julian. "Miss Tanaka expresses his deepest regrets for Mr. Thorne's condition and wishes him a swift recovery. He says that in Japan, a sudden crisis of health is understood as a matter of fate beyond anyone's control. He apologizes for his initial coldness and admits that he misread the situation entirely. He understands your position now." Julian felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. The fire was out. The bleeding had stopped. This woman, this waitress, had single-handedly pulled his entire $10 billion future back from the brink of oblivion. "Thank her," Julian said to Isabella, his voice filled with awe. "Tell him I am grateful for his understanding." Isabella translated his gratitude, then listened to Tanaka's reply. She turned back to Julian. "Mr. Tanaka says that while the circumstances are unfortunate, the evening is not yet lost. He suggests that if you are amenable, perhaps I could continue in the role of interpreter for the remainder of the dinner." Julian looked at Isabella. She was no longer just a waitress, a ghost in the room. She was his lifeline. She was the most important person in his world right now. "Absolutely," Julian said, his voice firm. "Please, ask her. Ask her what her name is." Isabella smiled faintly. "My name is Isabella Rossi, Mr. Croft." She then turned to Mr. Tanaka and introduced herself formally in Japanese. The dinner which had been awake was about to be resurrected, and at the center of it all was Isabella Rossi, a woman who had just stepped out of the shadows and into the very heart of a multi-billion-dollar negotiation. The mystery of who she was and how she came to be serving water in this restaurant was a question that now burned in Julian's mind, second only to the deal itself. What happened next was more than a simple translation. It was a performance of intellectual and cultural virtuosity that left every man in the room utterly captivated. Isabella pulled a vacant chair to a position slightly back from the table, equidistant between the two parties, a deliberate, symbolic placement. She was not a part of either delegation. She was the bridge connecting them. She refused offers of food or drink, taking only a glass of water. Her focus was absolute. The conversation restarted tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence as Isabella worked her magic. She was not a passive conduit for words. She was an active, intelligent filter. When Julian would use a blunt American business idiom like, "Let's cut to the chase," she wouldn't translate it literally. Mr. Croft suggests she would rephrase in elegant Japanese that in the interest of our mutual time, perhaps we can proceed directly to the core principles of the agreement. When Mr. Tanaka would respond with a long, rambling-seeming monologue that was in reality layered with subtle hints and tests of sincerity, she would distill it for Julian perfectly. "Mr. Tanaka is recounting the history of his company's founding," she explained once, after Tanaka spoke for 5 uninterrupted minutes. "He's not just reminiscing, he's emphasizing the principle of kaizen, or continuous improvement, and the deep personal honor he has invested in his technology. He wants reassurance that you see this acquisition not as a simple purchase of assets, but as the adoption of a legacy, a philosophy." This was the key Marcus Thorne was paid a fortune for. This was the cultural nuance that no machine could ever replicate, and Isabella was delivering it with an innate skill that felt less taught and more instinctual. The conversation moved from pleasantries to the finer points of the contract. This was the true test. Could she handle the dense technical jargon of robotics and the labyrinthine terminology of international finance? Mr. Sato Tanaka's technical lead posed a highly specific question about Croft Industries' plans for integrating Tanaka's proprietary neuromorphic processing units. He used a string of complex engineering terms. Julian watched, holding his breath. This was a detail even Marcus might have needed clarification on. Isabella didn't hesitate. She translated the question for Julian, and then, without being asked, added a brief parenthetical clarification in English. "He's referring to the chip architecture that mimics the human nervous system. It's the core of their AI's learning capability." Julian, impressed, gave his answer, detailing his plan for a 5-year, $2 billion R&D investment to scale the technology. Isabella relayed his response in Japanese. Her translation was so precise, so filled with the correct technical vocabulary, that Mr. Sato's eyes widened in genuine astonishment. He broke into a rapid-fire follow-up, and he and Isabella engaged in a brief, direct exchange. After a moment, she turned back to the room. "Forgive me," she said. "Mr. Sato was using a term for quantum entanglement that is specific to his research lab. I was simply confirming the context to ensure my translation for Mr. Croft was 100% accurate." David Chen, who had been silent and slack-jawed for the better part of an hour, finally choked out a whisper to Julian. "My God, Julian. Who is she? The top PhDs at MIT would struggle with that terminology." Julian could only shake his head, his awe growing with every sentence she spoke. He was watching a unicorn, a prodigy, serving scallops and pouring water. The absurdity of it was staggering. The turning point, the moment that transformed the atmosphere from professional respect to genuine warmth, came during the discussion of personnel. Tanaka expressed his deep concern for the fate of his longtime employees, the engineers and craftsmen who had dedicated their lives to his company. Julian, seeing his opening, spoke from the heart. "Tell him," he said to Isabella, his voice earnest, "that I see his team not as employees, but as pioneers. I started my company in a garage with 2 friends. I know what that loyalty means. I give him my personal word, not a single member of his team will be made redundant. We need their knowledge. We honor their dedication." Isabella translated his words, but she did more. Her tone conveyed Julian's sincerity. Her choice of words in Japanese words, invoking concepts of family duty and shared destiny, was masterful. A slow smile spread across Kenji Tanaka's face. It was the first genuine smile Julian had seen all night. It transformed his stern features, revealing a warmth that had been hidden behind a wall of caution. He spoke a few soft words in Japanese. Isabella's translation was simple, but it was everything. He says, "I believe you, Croft-san." The use of "san" instead of the more formal "sama," the simple statement of belief, it was the breakthrough. It was acceptance. The rest of the negotiation was a formality. The lawyers could hammer out the final details later. The foundation of trust had been laid not by a high-priced consultant, but by the quiet waitress who had seen them drowning and had thrown them a lifeline made of language and empathy. As the meal concluded, Mr. Tanaka stood. He did not offer a handshake. Instead, he gave Julian a deep, respectful bow. Julian, having learned his lesson, returned it as best he could. Then Mr. Tanaka did something extraordinary. He turned to Isabella. He bowed to her just as deeply. "Rossi-san," he said in Japanese, "you have done both our nations a great service tonight. You have a rare and profound gift." As the Japanese delegation prepared to leave, a wave of elation and profound curiosity washed over Julian. The deal was saved. His empire was secure. But the biggest mystery of the night remained. He caught Isabella's eye as she was discreetly clearing the last of the plates. "Don't go anywhere," he said, his voice low but firm. "When they've left you, and I are going to have a talk." Isabella simply nodded, her expression as calm and unreadable as it had been when the night began. The king had been saved, but he had no idea who his savior truly was. Once Mr. Tanaka and his team had departed, leaving a palpable sense of victory in their wake, a strange quiet fell over the room. David Chen was on the phone, speaking in hushed, excited tones to their legal team, already setting up the follow-through. For the first time all night, he looked relaxed. The color returned to his face. Julian, however, was not focused on the victory. His attention was entirely on Isabella Rossi. She had finished clearing the table with the same quiet diligence she'd shown all evening, as if she hadn't just single-handedly brokered a $10 billion truce. She was about to slip out of the room when Julian's voice stopped her. "Isabella." She turned her hand on the doorknob. "Yes, Mr. Croft." "Close the door. Please. Sit down." He gestured to the chair Mr. Tanaka had just vacated. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, the ingrained habit of a service worker, warring with the direct command of a CEO. Then she closed the door and walked to the table, though she did not sit. She stood beside the chair, her hands clasped respectfully in front of her. Julian studied her. The simple black and white uniform seemed like a costume, now a disguise hiding something far more complex. "I'm not going to insult you by offering you a tip." Julian began, his voice softer than she had heard it before, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "What you did in here tonight, I don't even have the words for it. You didn't just save a deal. You saved my company. You saved me." "I was glad I could be of assistance, Mr. Croft," she said politely. Her composure was unshakable. "Assistance?" Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. That was like saying Noah provided assistance with the flood. "I have one question, Isabella, and I need you to be honest with me. Who are you?" She finally looked at him directly, and for the first time he saw a flicker of weariness in her dark eyes, the story she was about to tell, casting a shadow across her face. "My story is not very exciting, sir," she began. "Let me be the judge of that," he said gently. She took a slow breath. "I was born in Rome. My father, Antonio Rossi, was an Italian diplomat. My mother was American, a professor of art history. I grew up moving every few years, Tokyo, Seoul, Beijing. Languages. They were never a choice for me. They were just the air I breathed." Julian leaned forward, completely absorbed. This explained the languages, but not the rest of it. "I attended Georgetown University at the Walsh School of Foreign Service." She continued, her voice, a flat, factual monotone. "I majored in international politics, with a concentration in East Asian security studies. My graduate thesis was on the role of honor in post-war Japanese corporate culture." David Chen, having ended his call, overheard this last part. He slowly sat down, his mouth agape. The School of Foreign Service at Georgetown was arguably the most prestigious international relations program in the world. Its graduates became ambassadors, CIA directors, and heads of state. They did not become waitresses at Aurelia. "I graduated summa cum laude," Isabella said, no hint of pride in her voice. "I had offers. The State Department, the UN, a few private strategic advisory firms here in New York." "What happened?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tragedy. "Life happened, Mr. Croft," she said, a profound sadness entering her tone. "The week after my graduation, my parents were in a car accident on the Merritt Parkway. A drunk driver. My mother was killed instantly." Julian felt a physical pang of sympathy. He remained silent, allowing her the space to continue. "My father survived," she said, her gaze drifting to a point on the far wall. "But he was changed. He suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. He was left with aphasia memory loss and required round-the-clock care. He didn't know who I was most days. The man who had negotiated treaties and spoke 6 languages could barely form a sentence." The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place for Julian, forming a heart-breaking picture. "The diplomatic corps has a pension, but it doesn't cover the kind of intensive long-term care he needed. His insurance maxed out within a year. I turned down the job offers. I brought him to my small apartment in Queens, and I became his caregiver. For 6 years. 6 years. Julian thought of his own life over the past 6 years. Acquisitions, product launches, global travel. A relentless upward climb. In that same time, this brilliant woman had sacrificed everything. I took whatever work I could that had flexible hours. Freelance proofreading, dog walking, and for the last 2 years, this job. The hours are long, but the pay is steady. It helped cover the medical bills. She finally looked back at him, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. My father passed away 8 months ago. I'm still paying off the debt. The room was silent. Julian felt a profound sense of humility, an emotion he rarely experienced. He had judged her, Or rather, he had failed to see her at all. He had looked at the uniform and seen a function, not a person, not a fallen star. He was about to speak when David, who had been listening with rapt attention, suddenly spoke up, his voice tinged with excitement. "Rossi," he said, looking at Isabella. "Antonio Rossi, the diplomat. I remember that name. He was the Undersecretary for Asian Affairs in the late 90s. He was legendary. He brokered the semiconductor trade agreement with Japan in 98. They called him the gentleman negotiator." Isabella gave a small, sad smile. He was a good man. Julian looked from David to Isabella, the final piece locking into place. This wasn't just raw talent he had witnessed tonight. It was a legacy. It was in her blood. She hadn't just learned the language. She had inherited the art of diplomacy itself. He stood up and walked around the table until he was standing in front of her. He looked at her, no longer seeing a waitress, but a peer. He saw the Georgetown prodigy, the diplomat's daughter, the brilliant strategist who had been sidelined by love and loyalty. "Isabella," he said, his voice imbued with a new kind of respect. "Your debt is cleared. Consider it done. But that's just the beginning. A person with your background, with your skill set. You don't belong here." He paused, his next words deliberate and heavy with meaning. "You belong at Croft Industries." Isabella stared at Julian, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. For 6 years, her world had been defined by survival, by the immediate needs of her father and the crushing weight of medical bills. The idea of a future beyond her next paycheck was a concept she hadn't allowed herself to entertain. "Mr. Croft," she said, her professional composure returning. "That's an incredibly generous offer, and I am grateful for your help with the debt, but I couldn't possibly accept more." Julian held up a hand. "This isn't charity, Isabella. Let me be perfectly clear. Charity is writing a check for a problem and walking away. This is an investment. What I saw you do tonight was not just translation. It was strategic communication at the highest possible level. You didn't just save a deal. You built a bridge of trust where there was none. I can't teach that. I can't buy that. It's innate." He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, which looked out over the glittering expanse of Manhattan. The city was a vast circuit board of light and ambition. "I have a division," he continued, his back to her, "the International Strategy Group. It's supposed to be the tip of my spear in global expansion. Right now, it's run by David here." He gestured to Chen, who nodded in agreement. "And a team of Ivy League MBAs who are brilliant with spreadsheets, but couldn't read a room if it was on fire." David had the good grace to look chagrined, but also to nod in acknowledgement of the truth. "He's not wrong," David admitted quietly. Julian turned back to face her. "They know the what of business, Isabella. You understand the who and the why. You understand that a negotiation with a man like Kenji Tanaka is about honor and legacy, not just EBITDA and market share. That's a skill worth more to me than 100 financial analysts." He let that sink in. "I'm not offering you a job as a translator. I'm offering you a position as Vice President of International Strategy. You'll report directly to me. You will be my advisor on all overseas ventures, starting with the integration of Tanaka Robotics. You will have a staff, you will have a budget, and you will have a salary that reflects the fact that you just saved this company $10 billion. The silence in the room was absolute. Isabella was stunned into immobility. Vice President. It was a title from another life, a dream she had packed away and buried years ago. She looked at her own hands, calloused slightly from carrying heavy trays. She thought of her small apartment in Queens, the stacks of medical bills on her kitchen table. She saw the path her life was on. years of waitressing to pay off a debt of honor, her intellect slowly dulling, her potential withering on the vine. And then she looked at Julian Croft, a man she had thought of as just another arrogant billionaire who was now offering her a lifeline back to the person she was meant to be. Tears welled in her eyes, the first crack in her iron composure all night. She quickly blinked them away. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Julian said simply. "Say yes and show up at Croft Tower at 9 a.m. on Monday. My assistant Maria will have your access card and your preliminary contract ready. We can work out the details then. Tonight, just say yes." 1,000 doubts and fears swirled in her mind. Was she ready? Could she do it? It had been so long. But then she thought of her father. She thought of the pride he had taken in her accomplishments, the dreams he'd had for her. He would not want her to squander her gifts out of fear. He would want her to seize this. She straightened her shoulders, and in that moment the waitress vanished completely. The diplomat's daughter, the Georgetown scholar, the brilliant strategist, stood in her place. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Yes, Mr. Croft, I accept." A wide, genuine smile broke across Julian's face. He extended his hand, not as a billionaire to a waitress, but as a CEO to his new executive. "Welcome to the company, Isabella," he said. She took his hand, and the handshake was firm. A deal sealed not with ink on paper, but with a promise of a new beginning. 2 months later, Isabella Rossi stood in her corner office on the 75th floor of Croft Tower. Her suit, a tailored design by the same tailor Julian used, was a world away from her black and white uniform. Below her, the city sprawled out a kingdom of possibilities. On her desk lay the finalized, signed, and celebrated Tanaka Croft Integration Plan, a document she had co-authored. She was in the middle of a conference call this time with a team of engineers in Berlin, switching effortlessly between English and German. Her voice was confident, her insights sharp, her authority unquestioned. Julian Croft happened to be walking by her office and paused for a moment, watching her through the glass wall. He saw the same poise, the same intelligence she'd shown in the restaurant, but now it was unleashed, thriving in its natural environment. David Chen came up beside him. "Best hire you ever made," David said quietly. Julian nodded, a rare, humble smile on his face. "She wasn't a hire, David. She was a discovery, a reminder that the greatest value is often hidden in the last place you think to look." He watched Isabella laugh at something an engineer said, her face bright with purpose. He had gone into that restaurant, seeking to conquer a new territory for his empire. He had walked out, having found its future queen. 6 months after Isabella Rossi traded her waitress apron for a corner office, the legend of that night at Aurelia had become part of the company's internal mythology. But for Isabella, it wasn't a myth. It was a baseline she had to exceed every single day. She now chaired the Tanaka Integration Committee, and the boardroom, once a place of terrifying prestige, had become her arena. She moved through its complex dynamics with the same quiet efficiency she had once used to clear a table, her insights cutting through corporate jargon like a heated knife through butter. David Chen and the other VPs no longer saw a waitress. They saw a leader whose unique perspective consistently outmaneuvered their conventional MBA playbooks. She had built a genuine rapport with the teams in Japan, not just through flawless language skills, but through small, meaningful gestures, remembering an engineer's daughter was starting university, sending a note of congratulations on a team's work anniversary that demonstrated the respect Julian had promised. The integration was proceeding smoother than anyone had dared to hope. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Julian burst into the boardroom, where Isabella was mid-presentation, his face a thundercloud. He wasn't holding a phone or a document. He held the latest issue of the Financial Sentinel, and he slapped it down on the polished table. The headline was a poison dart: Omnicorp wooing Tanaka trio as Croft's cultural promises falter. The article detailed how Franklin Pierce Julian's arch-nemesis at Omnicorp was actively recruiting Tanaka Robotics' three most vital engineers, the very minds behind the neuromorphic processors. Pierce wasn't just offering them astronomical salaries. He was preying on their fears, positioning himself as a savior who would create a new independent lab for them, preserving their creative integrity from the American corporate machine. "He's gutting us, Isabella." Julian growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed the man he'd been before that fateful dinner. "He's not buying the company, so he's stealing the engine right out of it. This isn't business, it's vandalism." His old ruthless instincts flared to life. "Get legal on the line. We'll sue them for tortious interference. Maria," he yelled toward his intercom, "get me the head of HR. I want to triple whatever offer Pierce made them. We'll drown him in cow." The other executives in the room began murmuring, pulling out phones ready to spring into a familiar mode of corporate warfare. But Isabella remained still, her eyes fixed on the article. She waited for the initial shock wave of Julian's anger to pass. When he finally paused for breath, she spoke, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the rising panic. "They won't accept more money, Julian." Julian turned to her, his frustration boiling over. "What are you talking about?" "Everyone has a price. Not for this," Isabella countered, standing up. "This isn't about money. If it were, they would have negotiated for more during the acquisition. Franklin Pierce is a predator, but he's a clever one. He isn't offering them a bigger paycheck. He's offering them a story." She picked up the newspaper. "He's telling them that your promise of honoring their legacy was a lie. That you're a typical American CEO who will swallow their culture and spit out a generic R&D department. Every dollar we throw at them now will just look like a desperate attempt to prove him wrong. It will make us look weak, and worse, confirm his narrative that we think their loyalty can be bought." Julian stared at her, his anger warring with the undeniable logic of her words. He had hired her for this exact kind of insight. "So what do we do?" he demanded. "We just let him poach them?" "No," Isabella said, her gaze firm. "We don't fight him on his battlefield. We bring them back to ours." The foundation of our deal with Mr. Tanaka was a promise of honor and partnership. We need to reaffirm it not with money, but with action. We have to remind them what they stand to lose by leaving not a salary, but a legacy. She walked to the window, looking down at the city below. "Don't send lawyers or HR executives. Send the one person whose word they trusted in the first place." She turned back to him. "Send yourself. You and I will fly to Tokyo. Tonight. We won't arrive with contracts. We'll arrive with the blueprints for the new Tanaka Croft Innovation Institute, a facility we will build for them in Kyoto, their home city. We show them that we aren't just absorbing their company. We are planting its roots even deeper into their own soil." The room fell silent. Julian looked at the furious, vengeful plans of his top executives, and then he looked at Isabella's audacious, empathetic strategy. It was a choice between his old self and the leader he was trying to become. He saw again the woman who had stood with a water pitcher and rescued his entire future, not with aggression, but with understanding. A slow smile touched his lips. He pressed the intercom button on the table. "Maria," he said, his voice calm and decisive once more. "Cancel my afternoon. and book 2 first-class tickets to Tokyo for Ms. Rosie and myself. We have a promise to keep." That night at Aurelia wasn't just the story of a saved business deal. It's a powerful, real-life reminder that a person's circumstances never tell the whole story. The world is full of brilliant minds and extraordinary talents, hidden in plain sight in coffee shops, in delivery trucks, in quiet offices, and yes, even serving your table. Julian Croft was lucky enough to have his world turned upside down, forcing him to see the value he had overlooked. Isabella Rossi was brave enough to seize her moment when it arrived. Their story asks us a question. Who are we overlooking in our own lives? What potential are we failing to see? If this story of unexpected triumph and second chances moved you, please give this video a like. It helps us share more stories like this with the world. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that their current situation doesn't define their destiny. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that proves that sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones we haven't truly met yet. Thank you for listening.